Okay, so I am Matthew Levy or Matt Levy. I am a solutions architect. I'm also an enterprise mobility MVP. Enterprise mobility means a whole lot of things. Security, but it also means identity and access management. So I'm the AD guy. So it's fitting that I speak about today Azure AD Domain Services or Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So with that, let me kick off. So identity is the primary control plane now. And what that means is you're managing access to apps and data using identity. You're no longer able to control things using traditional network security boundaries because things are out there. They're in the cloud, software as a service. So identity or authentication is a very important decision to make. So don't make your authentication and identity decision lightly. Don't take it lightly. Authentication is the first decision for moving to the cloud. Authentication is critical in controlling access to all cloud data and resources. And it's also the foundation for all other advanced security and user experience features. And just bear in mind that changing your authentication method requires a lot of planning and testing and potentially some downtime. So with Microsoft, we have three choices in terms of identity. We have Active Directory, which a lot of people are familiar with, most people are familiar with, because it's what we've had on premises for years in Windows Server, and it's actually known as Active Directory Domain Services, AADDS. So there's the first acronym. The next thing we have is Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory, and I'll get into what that is later on, but that's a Microsoft Cloud service. So it's identity as a service. And now there's a third option called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or AADDS. That's the third acronym. So the second acronym is Azure Active Directory AAD. Third one is AADDS. So as organizations move to the cloud, they need to have assurance that they have controls over their environment. And in this morning's session with Warren and Glenn, we saw controlling things that are in multiple clouds and using Azure as the control plane, but more importantly, using identity as the control plane. And that's why I asked the question about service principles. So more security, more visibility is supported and available through automation and insights in a cloud governed and managed world. So cloud governed management describes how organizations manage and govern their users, applications, groups, and devices from the cloud. So let's take a step back. Let's have a look at Active Directory. So Active Directory, it's servers that you deploy on premises. You manage those servers. It's 100% your responsibility. What you get in Active Directory are, amongst other things, you get users and computers, management of users and computers. You can arrange those into your own custom organizational units, OUs. So you have a structure. You have DNS, and DNS is integrated into Active Directory. Group policies, so you can manage devices and users and deploy policies for securing those objects, or just settings and configuring those objects. You have LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Kerberos, NTLM, those are authentication protocols. And you have trust. So trust being a relationship between your identity provider, Active Directory, and another identity provider, another Active Directory forest. It could be your own company with multiple departments or locations, but it could also be trust between yourself and partners. Moving to the cloud, we have Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory has a lot of things, but it's very different to Active Directory. It has users and groups that are managed. You can manage users and groups, security groups, as well as B2B. So there are your external partnerships. There's applications. So you register applications within Azure Active Directory. Those can be third-party applications, software as a service applications, or your line of business applications. And through that, you have access controls to those applications through conditional access and a number of other security features. You also have devices through something like Intune or an MDM, but the Azure Active Directory, the devices get registered into Azure Active Directory. And then you can manage mobile devices and Windows desktops, as well as Windows servers. You get the benefit of single sign-on to those software as a service offerings and any application that is registered within Azure Active Directory. And you get role-based access control. Now, what you don't get is OUs, so you don't have organizational unit structures, and you can't create a custom structure or hierarchy. It's a very flat structure. You don't have DNS, really. There is Azure DNS, but you can't manage it. Azure DNS is a completely separate thing, but in Azure Active Directory, you don't really have access to DNS and you can't control the zones. You don't have group policies, and so there is management of devices in Intune, for example, but you don't have the granularity of GPOs. You also don't have those legacy authentication protocols. So AAD uses modern authentication protocols such as OAuth, SAML, or OpenID Connect. SAML, in case you don't know, is security assertion markup language. And you don't really have trusts. So you can't have your organization's AAD trusting another organization's AAD. There is the B2B part, but that's another discussion altogether. So there is a link in the slide where you can go and have a look and compare Active Directory to Azure Active Directory and what you get and what you don't get. Now, we've spoken before on this user group about Windows Virtual Desktop, and it's a big thing at the moment. Windows Virtual Desktop, I just want to point out, won't work with just AAD because those session hosts that provide Windows Virtual Desktop need to be domain joined, and they use Kerberos for authentication. So you need to have a domain. So with WVD with Active Directory, your on-premises Active Directory, this is what the infrastructure would look like, because you've got on the right-hand side, you've got all your session hosts in Azure, and they need to connect to your on-premises Active Directory servers. Alternatively, you can spin up directory services or domain controllers in Azure, but you still have to have that connectivity to your on-premises domain controllers so that replication can happen. So it's a bit of a complex extension of your Active Directory. So you could do that. You could absolutely extend your Active Directory into Azure by deploying IaaS VMs and promoting them to domain controllers. The caveat there is that you have to have a continuous connection between Azure and your on-premises network. Now enter Azure Active Directory Domain Services, AADDS. So AADDS provides a managed domain. So it's a Microsoft AD that Microsoft manage for you. And essentially what happens is domain controllers get deployed for you and you don't have to manage them. So you don't have to patch them. You don't have to make sure that the schema is up to date. You don't have control of the schema. And basically it's provided to you as a service. But what it does provide is it provides a limited set of the features that you had in an on-premises Active Directory. So you've got users and computers, you've got OUs, you've got DNS, sort of, and group policies, so you can manage devices. And then you've got those legacy authentication protocols, LDAP, Kerberos, NTLM. And Truss has an asterisk because I'll get into that later, but Truss, there is a caveat. You have to have a resource forest only, and only resource forests can have a one-way trust to other domains. So what you still need for AADDS, Azure Active Directory Domain Services, is a link to your Azure Active Directory. So the source essentially is Azure Active Directory, and there is a continuous sync, a one-way sync from Azure Active Directory to AADDS. So your users and computer objects, no, sorry, not computer objects, your user objects are synchronized, users and groups are synchronized in the backend to your AADDS. So what that does is it extends your central identity cases so that applications that are using traditional authentication mechanisms can run in Azure as part of a lift and shift strategy. There are obviously organizations who have on-premises Active Directory and are moving to the cloud and want to lift and shift those applications. And so there you would synchronize from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. And in most cases, people are doing that already to utilize things like Office 365. They're synchronizing their identities from on-premises to Azure Active Directory. And then in turn, those objects will synchronize from Azure Active Directory to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Now, the key here is the password hash. So if you have AAD Connect deployed and you're synchronizing objects, you have to enable password hash sync if it's not enabled today. That is because NTLM and Kerberos use legacy password hashes, and those legacy password hashes will not be available in AADDS if they are not synchronized from on-premises. So from end to end, from left to right, you have to pass, or we have to sync the password hashes. So when you sync from AAD Connect to AAD, those password hashes are automatically synchronized to AADDS. Incidentally, AAD has no way of storing password hashes. So password hashes are never stored in Azure Active Directory. So this is just an architectural diagram of how it would look. You have your Windows Active Directory server, Azure Active Directory Connect synchronizing objects to Microsoft Azure Active Directory, and then through the managed service syncing into your virtual network in Azure, so you have access to those identities. It is a completely separate domain. It's not the same domain as what you have on premises, although the user principal names carry through. So you can still log in as bob@ignite.buzz from your on-premises server to your managed domain. So now I'll switch to show you Azure Active Directory domain services in Azure in the portal. So just finding my screen. Right. Okay. So over here, this is my Azure Active Directory tenant. Incidentally, it is synchronizing from on-premises. So I've got AAD Connect servers, a primary and a staging server, and I'm synchronizing identities into this tenant. So I do have objects in here, thousands of them. And so if I'm going to deploy Azure Active Directory domain services, I go into the portal and I go type domain services in the search, and here's Azure AD domain services. Now I have a domain service deployed because in the interest of time, it takes 45 minutes to deploy it. So I wouldn't want you to sit and watch a deployment. So I have already deployed one. And the reason it takes that long is because it is spinning up resources in your Azure subscription. And so it's creating two domain controllers. The domain controllers you don't see. They're VMs, but Microsoft manage those VMs. They're in a Microsoft subscription somewhere. What you do see are the network interfaces. They're injected into your VNet. And then you have a load balancer and a public IP address. Then what happens in the background is the synchronization between Azure Active Directory and your domain controllers. They're dedicated to you through those public IP address, or through that public IP address and load balancer. So this is the management blade for AADDS. As you can see, it's running, and you can see the health of the synchronization and the backups. If you go to properties, you can see where I've deployed it. It shows me the IP addresses of those domain controllers. Now, there's DNS running on those domain controllers, so I can use those IP addresses for DNS. I have a network security group that applies to the subnet, and it needs to be in a dedicated subnet. So Microsoft recommend having a dedicated VNet for AADDS, but that's not necessarily the case. You don't have to have a dedicated VNet as long as you have a dedicated subnet within the VNet, because it needs space for those two domain controllers. Then it adds an NSG to the subnet, and the NSG controls the ports that are required for synchronization, as well as authentication and LDAP access to your domain. You can enable secure LDAP or LDAP-S. For LDAP-S, you need a certificate. You can use a public certificate or an internally, a CA, a PKI infrastructure generated certificate. I obviously have not enabled it. Then there's the synchronization. You can scope what gets synchronized. So by default, it synchronizes all users and security groups, but you can scope it so that it only synchronizes a subset of what you have in Azure Active Directory. And there's obviously some SKUs. So there's a standard, an enterprise, and a premium. What the difference is, The standard, you can't deploy replica sets, and I'll explain replica sets later. Enterprise and Premium you can, but also the difference is the performance and the backup schedule. So when you have Enterprise or Premium, you have the performance of the domain controllers. So if you're doing a lot of authentication requests, you may have to increase the SKU to cater for those authentication requests. But the other thing is the backup frequency, and typically between 1 and 14 days is how often the domain controllers get backed up. So there's not much to see in the portal, but I will show you my resources so that you can understand what it deploys when you add a new domain service. So here you can see the network interfaces, 2 network interfaces, and it's got a string name that Microsoft issues. So you have no control over the naming of those network interfaces. The load balancer similarly, and the load balancer, if we have a look at it, has got some, it's got backend pools, which are the 2 domain controllers, essentially. These are the domain controllers. You can see 10.0.3.4 and 3.5, and they've got a nice name that you can reference quite easily. So those are the backend servers in the backend pool. And then there's a load balancing rule. There's not a load balancing rule, sorry, there's an inbound NAT rule, and there's an outbound rule. So that's the load balancer essentially. It just, and that's all created and managed for you. There's the public IP address and the network security group that gets deployed. So just a word of warning, don't try and pre-create these things because Microsoft have a very specific rule set that go into the NSG, for example. And if you've deployed an NSG and you have missed one rule, the whole deployment will fail. So it's always best to let the deployment create the NSG for you. When it creates the NSG, it creates it with this name, AADDS. You can pre-create it, and there is a PowerShell script to pre-create the NSG, but then it pre-creates all those rules that Microsoft require. Let's have a look at those rules quickly. So here you can see it's synchronization rules, so it can sync between Azure Active Directory and your domain service. And then there's remote PowerShell tools so that Microsoft can manage those VMs from their side. And then there's from your virtual network, you can access the domain services. So there's an any, which basically means that all the Active Directory ports that are required in a typical Active Directory deployment are open in Azure so that you can connect from your Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts or any machine that you domain join to this domain. And I also have deployed a VM, which I've called AADDS Man 2019. It's a management VM, which is just a member server with the management tools on it. So I can connect to that managed domain with the management tools that I'm used to from Active Directory. So Active Directory users and computers, Group Policy Management Console, Active Directory Admin Center, all those tools work with a managed domain. So I can manage my managed domain with those tools. There are some permissions that you get issued or you get to that domain. You don't get enterprise admin or domain admin, although you get a subset of those permissions. So if I go back to the back to Azure Active Directory, there is a group that gets created in Azure Active Directory called AADDS Administrators. This group gets synchronized across into your managed domain, and the members of this group essentially are the administrators of your AADDS domain. It's like domain admins, but you don't have the full elevated domain admins role. You've got a subset of it, but you can essentially do whatever you need to do with group policies, OUs, etc., etc. So be sure to populate this group with members that can then manage your domain. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to connect and share my screen. Give me 1 second. While I'm switching screens. Come on, Teams. Okay. So now you should see I'm logged on to a 2016 server. This is a VM that I've spun up in Azure that is connected to that domain. And if I have a look at the tools that I have available to me, because essentially I've just gone and installed the RSAT, Remote Server Administration tools. And I've now got Active Directory users and computers, etc., etc. And if I run those, I can see my managed domain. So here's my domain. By default, things go into this AADDS users OU. There's a lot in there. And I can manage those users there. These users are synchronized from Azure Active Directory. I can also create users directly into this directory. However, they don't get synchronized back to Azure Active Directory. So they'll only exist here. And for example, I might want to create a service account so that I can join machines to the domain with a service account rather than using an on-premises account or an account from Azure Active Directory. Similarly, when I domain join to this domain, all the computers are added here. So here you can see I've got a couple of machines that are domain joined. And these tools are very familiar to me because I've managed Active Directory on premises. So I can, I can do whatever I could do with a machine on premises. I can do within this managed domain as long as it's joined to the domain. So here's the DNS name of my machine. Just while we're talking about DNS names, when you create a managed domain, an AADDS domain, you can use a routable DNS namespace. You have to own the zone for that, so just bear that in mind. And it needs to be routable. If you don't, you can spin one up that is it will be hosted on Microsoft.com zone, but then you can't do things like LDAP-S because you can't you can't create any records in that zone. So that's essentially it from a demo perspective. These are users and computers and other things like Azure files get synchronized into here. If you've got Azure files that are AAD joined, they get synchronized into here so you can see the objects for Azure file storage. And yeah, essentially it's like a normal Active Directory. So let me end the demo there and go back to the PowerPoint. I've got a couple of slides. Alrighty, so the next slide is questions. I've got some questions that I thought I would throw in there because maybe you have these questions on my top of mind, but I just thought I'd throw them in. And please feel free to ask other questions. So, is it highly available? Yes, it is. So, like you saw, when you deploy it, Microsoft deploy 2 domain controllers for you, and those are deployed into an availability set where availability sets are available or availability zones are available. So Microsoft will handle the availability there. So if one fails, it'll automatically take over on the other one, and you've always got 2 deployed in a region. How do you administer AADDS? I've just shown you through a domain joined machine with the traditional Active Directory management tools. Is there disaster management for AADDS? Yes, there is. There is replica sets. Now, so when I mentioned high availability, it deploys 2 domain controllers per region. When you enable replica sets, which at the moment is in a preview state, it's not GA, replica sets create a complete separate instance of your managed domain. It's still linked to your Azure Active Directory, but there's another set of domain controllers, and I have a order. So in region A, you've got your 2 domain controllers that are injected into your virtual network, and then in region B, when you deploy another replica set, you've got 2 domain controllers injected into your virtual network in region B. What makes it all work is the VNet peering and the global VNet peering. So you have to have separate VNets, obviously, region A and region B. You can't have a VNet that stretches across a region. And then those regional VNets need to be peered. That's global VNet peering. And then any applications that use your managed domain may live in separate VNets. Those VNets also need to be VNet peered to your AADDS VNet, or at least access the subnet. Trusts. What about trusts? There are trusts, as I mentioned earlier, but you have to deploy a resource forest. So AADDS can be deployed into 2 modes. 2 modes: user forest or resource forest. With a resource forest, you don't get any users synchronized into it. Essentially, that's just an empty domain that you can then domain join servers and workstations to. And you can obviously create GPOs and manage those devices or those server objects, computer objects within that resource forest. Then you would want to have a trust relationship back to your on-premises Active Directory so that your users' identities can access those resources. So it's a one-way outbound trust. It doesn't go the other way. So your on-premises Active Directory doesn't trust anything that's in the resource forest. It's the other way around. The user forest is only synchronizing users and security groups, and you can't add a trust to a user forest. So there's a bit of a caveat there. So obviously, if you need to deploy trusts, you have to do a lot of planning and consider that you can only do one or the other. Do I need to back up the domain controllers? No, you don't. And that's the beauty of a managed service. You don't have to patch it. You don't have to back it up. It is backing up automatically all the time, typically every 1 to 14 days. What they're saying is if you are not seeing a backup successfully completed after 14 days, longer than 14 days, could be an issue, and synchronization could be causing a backup failure, or there might be a health alert on your managed domain, which could be causing the backups to fail. The synchronization, incidentally, happens more or less daily, but it depends on how many objects you have in your Azure Active Directory, because it has to synchronize those objects. So it could take quite long to synchronize, and therefore it might go more than a day between synchronizations. But typically it's daily. There is a synchronization from AAD to AADDS. Can I move my AADDS to another subscription or tenant? No, you can't. So the domain controllers are registered to your Azure Active Directory tenant, and similarly, they're deployed into a VNet in a subscription. If you want to move them, you have to delete it and create it again. Creating it again will cause the synchronization to happen. Any customization that you've done in the managed domain, you will have to recreate. So GPOs, OU structure, etc. So once it's attached to a directory, that's where it should stay. And then another question that I thought might be on people's minds is, why would you have Active Directory synchronizing into Azure Active Directory and then synchronizing to AADDS? And the answer to that is, it's part of the journey to remove on-premises domain controllers or your on-premises footprint. So applications, legacy applications that require LDAP or Kerberos, they can move into the cloud and be quite easily refactored to join this managed domain rather than your on-premises domain. And eventually, you can remove your on-prem AD. If you are a cloud-first organization, in other words, you don't have on-premises Active Directory, but you have an application that requires LDAP or Kerberos authentication types, then you can go AAD to AADDS. You wouldn't have that on-premises component. And so with that, those are the questions that I initially had and thought people might want to know. So if anyone else has questions, please feel free to ask. Nick, you have your hand up.
I do indeed. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask, so if I've got on-premises Active Directory and I want to go to AADDS, but I want to keep all my GUIDs, I want to keep my SIDs, I want to keep all the stuff that is in on-premises Active Directory and not lose any of that, and so skip the step of going to AAD first, why can or can't I do that?
Okay, so you can't skip the step of going to AAD first, because like I said, the managed domain is attached and synchronized to AAD. So there's a secure connection. There's actually a certificate connection between AAD and AADDS. So objects have to exist in AAD to be synchronized. There is some form of SID history that gets replicated, that gets synchronized. So I'm not sure what the requirement would be, but there is some form of SID history that gets synchronized. So in the documentation, it does go into what is synchronized and what is not synchronized. So it may be that there is an answer to your question there, but to answer the second part of your question, no, you can't skip AAD.
Cool, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Guess I asked and answered all the questions.
That was lovely, Matthew. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Awesome stuff, Matt. I think one of the biggest questions a lot of customers have, and we see this all the time, because everyone wants to move to the cloud. It's always, can we move to the cloud? How do we do that? And in the world that I occupy space in, most of the time, customers are wanting to say, well, let's modernize an application, because Warren has been talking about Kubernetes to everyone that wants to hear the word Kubernetes for the last 3 years. You know, even I now have to accept the fact that Kubernetes is part of my life, which took me a long time. But when we start looking at customers that are modernizing their applications to run in this new world in the cloud, there are still things that cannot be modernized, and they are still going to need some form of authentication mechanism that is not Azure AD in Azure. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are right now. You know, that's exactly what customers are asking. So as much as hybrid, and I use the word hybrid lightly, because in the beginning, hybrid was all the rage, because hybrid would exist while you are moving to the cloud. And then that would be your journey, right? Hybrid is a journey. In today's world, hybrid has become an end state, because there are certain workloads that you can't move. But with AADDS, we now have an option to actually go back into business and say, well, in fact, we really don't need to worry about this server 2012 virtual machine that's running this application that cannot be modernized. We can actually take it with us to the cloud, even though it's using traditional auth, NPLM, and it will still occupy space as if it's part of our perimeter network, and we can decommission that piece of tin that's been running for 7 years. So I'm excited about where Microsoft is going with AADDS or ADDS or whatever 5-letter
ADHD,
whatever one you want to use. And I think it's important for consultants and customers out there to understand that hybrid was a journey, and then it became an end state, and now it's moving back to becoming a journey. And I encourage everyone to understand how it works, because there's a fair amount of permutations around multiple forests, multiple domains, interconnects between the federation and trusts, and how we can synchronize so that we can actually have one true master identity. I think for me that is the holy grail, that hidden elixir that most infrastructure teams struggle with when they've been running 17 sites globally, and all of a sudden the executive board says, well, we want one identity because we want one tenant.
And essentially the nirvana that we're striving for is having, like with Azure Arc, where you can manage your data and your servers and your services through one management plane. Identity should be managed from one identity plane, management plane. And so the nirvana is to have Azure being the single source of truth, so to speak. And so everything starts and ends in Azure, and you're not limited to having things deployed only in Azure, but Azure is the control plane. So you're using identity services in Azure, and there's so much that's available to people with Azure Active Directory. All the single sign-ons, conditional access policies, identity risk, all the insight that comes along with it. And if you can use that to control everything, that's where we're striving to go. So you're right. The hybrid identity, it was a journey, then it became a long-term hybrid thing. And how long is long-term? It seems like it's forever, right? But and because realistically there are organizations out there that have applications and legacy services that can't just run in Azure Active Directory. So that's why we're going back to a journey where we can actually, we can start using those services in Azure, and it's all managed for me. I don't have to deploy servers, clunky 2012 R2 servers or whatever that I have to patch and manage. It's all managed for me. It's all, Microsoft's problem, so to speak. So yeah, that's where we're going.
If they, who's that? Someone's got their hand up.
It's me.
It's me.
It's just a question about, I can see this is a journey. Just as a speculation, I would speculate that AAD and AADDS at some point in time are going to become one. It got a sense from a management perspective.
Yeah, I'm not sure though, because they are so different. Azure AD is modern authentication protocols and a whole lot of insight that goes along with it. Yeah, I'm not sure that it would become one, but I suppose it could be that Azure Active Directory then gives you the capability to manage legacy things through Kerberos and NTLM through the same portal, but they're completely different beasts, so to speak.
Yeah, I can see that there are definitely some things in DDS that aren't in AAD. I don't know. I think if I was looking at it from an infrastructure management point of view, this just sort of adds an extra level of complexity, which maybe we could take away if at least we had a front end that looked as though the two things were the same.
And I think that's maybe what you're getting at is it might become one, but it's a management thing. And so you manage the two, but to you it looks like one thing.
Absolutely. So it doesn't matter how many components you have in a backend, because really nobody minds how many components there are. It really doesn't make too much difference. But when you come to managing it and operationally, it starts to make a difference. Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. That was a great presentation.
Thanks.